Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the ICCP's second construction clinic. My name's Nina. I'll take you through a short housekeeping presentation and a introduction to the ITCP, and then we'll get straight into questions. On your screen, you should see a control panel. There's only a couple of things that you need to be aware of. One is the hand icon, which you should see on the screen there. If you have any issues with audio today, or you need any help with questions or anything at all, just raise your hand. I'll come around and send you a message and see if I can help. And then the questions, you'll see a question box there on your control panel as well. So feel free to send your questions in through there. Or if you're brave enough to ask your question live on the session, then again, raise your hand. I can unmute your microphone and you can ask Andy and Lee directly. Okay, so an introduction to the ICCP. What is the ITCP? Well, we are a professional members organisation and we recognise construction professionals with skills, qualifications and expertise in the professional management of claims. We have three core objectives, and those are to establish international professional standards for the management of claims, to give recognition to those who have gained the appropriate knowledge and experience in the management of claims, and also to help and educate those who would like to gain that experience in the management of claims. So our membership levels, we have three levels of membership: associate, member and fellow. Application and acceptance to the Institute at any of those levels would entitle you to use those designatory letters after your name, ICCP, for example. All of those levels come with their own set of prerequisites, which you will find on the ICCP website. So if you would like more information about the Institute and about the membership and obviously the benefits involved, have a visit to the ICCP website or drop me a line. I'm more than happy to provide you with more information. Right, so the clinic is now open, and I'd like to invite Andy and Lee, who are going to kick off with some of the questions that we received prior to the session by email, and then we'll open up the floor to live questions on the session today.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Nina, and welcome to our second clinic. It's a little bit of a changed format. Last week, for those of you who attended, we picked a topic which happened to be notices, and we did a small talk on it, but that left us with a limited time for questions, and we didn't get through all the questions that people had pre-submitted, and certainly didn't have any chance for people to ask questions on the day. So we decided this time we'd do without the topic, and we just throw it open for pre-submitted questions and live questions, and we'll take whatever people throw at us. So, and I think, you know, if one person's got a question, many other people will be interested in that answer. This is what we find on our training course. There's only one brave person that puts his hand up to ask, but everybody else is interested in it. So we can all learn from this. So we're going to go down the list. I'm going to kick off, then we'll hand over and Lee can deal with one. The first question is from Ernst Erasmus. And unsurprisingly, it's to do with coronavirus and it's to do with FIDIC. And the question is, where is the coronavirus categorized under FIDIC Red Book with regard to the payment of cost? Well, it isn't exactly. I've looked at this in a great deal of detail. In actual fact, the ICCP have published a paper specifically on the coronavirus. And okay, I think we're pretty clear that you're entitled to an extension of time under 8.4 because it's a governmental action and, or what's the phrase? Epidemic, I think. You're also pretty much entitled under clause 14, which is force majeure, to an extension of time. But when it comes to the payment of cost associated with the extension of time or any other cost associated with the coronavirus, there are some qualifications, and FIDIC aren't really clear about it. We're talking about cost now, and one of the things it says it's got to be of the kind listed, and the kinds that the FIDIC refer to in that list are all man-made things, such as hostilities, war, taking over of power, etc., etc. So it doesn't tick that box. Then it says, but it's not limited to those things. So does that mean there are other man-made things, or does it mean that it can be anything whatsoever? So there's a maybe there. And then if we look at the further qualification, FIDIC says that the event, or the effects of the event, we could say, have got to have happened in the country, and the country being the country where the project or the site or most of it is located. So if we've got a situation whereby we are procuring plant materials equipment from China, and China is delayed in manufacture, and that delays the project, that's not, and the project is, I don't know, in the UK, well, that's probably not claimable for cost. If we've got a situation where the UK government restricts travel and effectively closes business down, well, that did occur in the country, so that maybe you're entitled to cost. So in summary, FIDIC is not very clear about whether you are entitled to cost. I would say if you're a contractor, if you think, give it a try. But of course, you've got the engineers on the other side of the fence that will say, this is doubtful, it's not clear cut, so that's a reason to reject claims for cost. So I can see quite a few disputes coming. So if we can sit down and try and agree things before we start slinging claims about and slinging disputes about, that would be preferable. Going on to the second part of Ernst's question, would you suggest we include in contracts, or sorry, what would you suggest we include in contracts to deal with potential coronavirus related disruption to supply chains, etc.? Well, I've explained that FIDIC is grey and doesn't really deal with, or doesn't describe a circumstance that you can slot coronavirus into. Having said that, this morning I was reviewing a contract for a client, and this is a bespoke contract, and unlike most big bespoke contracts which tend to be less clear than FIDIC, this was actually the other way around. And it actually listed plague and epidemic as an item that could constitute force majeure, and it specifically said the contractor can have time but can't claim for costs for a force majeure event. Well done, whoever put that contract together, because there's no argument there. Yes, you can have time. No, you can't have any costs. So we take away all that uncertainty. And to answer the question, I would improve clinic by specifically including or excluding plague and mass epidemic as a force majeure event or not. So thanks for that one, Ernst. I hope that answers your question. So for the next one, I'm going to hand over to Lee.
Okay, it looks like Lee might be having some technical issues. So just want to skip on to the next question, Andy, and then we'll try to get Lee back.
Okay, no problem. So the next one is from Henry Lee. Thank you for your question, Henry. Whenever the client stroke consultant initiates a variation, order or change, does it mean that the contractor should input extra resources to complete the work? Fairly easy answer there, Henry. No, it doesn't. If the client or the employer wants a variation to be undertaken, the contractor is under no obligation to increase resources to undertake that variation, unless by agreement. I mean, if the client says, look, we want to do all this extra work, we still want to meet the completion time, so can you do it quicker? And you as the contractor say, yeah, we can bring all these extra resources in, but we're not going to be able to work as efficiently, and we're going to have mobilization and demobilization costs. So if you meet our costs for doing so, now we're on to acceleration. Yes, we can, but no, the contractor is not obliged. And an example that Henry's given, imagine contract completion of the project to be 120 days left, and the client initiates a VO, and the changes may affect the project completion. I think the contractor is obliged to report the time implication. Not quite sure what that means. If it means send a notice that the project is going to be delayed, I agree. But at the same time, the changes have given extra workload to the contractor. How can the contractor respond in this case? Well, if we're talking a FIDIC contract, you're entitled to an extension of time under clause 8.4 because it's a variation, and most other forms of contract will give an entitlement. But again, FIDIC and other forms of contract, send in your notice. Thanks for your variation instruction. This gives us a lot more extra work. It's going to impact that cause us to suffer delay and incur costs, and then follow up with your claim. So thank you very much, Henry. I think Lee's back with us, so
Sorry
let me handle
about that. Did you cover Henry's there, Andy?
Yes, I did, Henry. So if you could dip back to Simon Rowlands.
I'm going to Simon. Right, Simon's question was 3 parts. The first part being, what factors should be taken into account when deciding the best method of delay analysis? It's quite simple. What does the contract say? And then what records do you have available? They're really going to determine what methodology you use. Personally, if it was at the start of a contract, it's quite straightforward, access problem, and impacted as planned, because it's straightforward. You can't start the work, so the whole program shifts. If you're partway through a program, a window form of analysis to record actual data, so you don't have a theoretical entitlement. So that would be my approach on producing the delay analysis, and the factors are quite simple, as I said. It's what your contract says and what records do you have available. The SCL will give you a list of records that should be available for all the different types of methods. The second question was, what happens when the parties cannot agree a revised program? Experienced this a couple of times, breaking that down, if the parties can't agree on logic, then the contractor's construction methodology, if it's sound, should win that argument. If it's down onto duration of activities, then the contractor's productivity rate to show that quantity can be produced by that many men in that duration, that should win that argument. If you're being by one party saying we're not going to approve the program because we don't like your sequence, under FIDIC and the SCL, they both recommend, well, they both state that it's up to the contractor to produce his program to comply with the contract. As long as he complies with the contract, the program should be accepted. So SCL have got a nice speech about that, and FIDIC, it's under 8.3, stating that the employer, the engineer, should reply within 21 days and give a notice that the program does not comply with the contract. Not, I don't like the way you're going to do the block work on the full floor. That's not rejection. So you've got some good arguments to go back and fight that. If you get to a stage where the client's just not approving the program, don't give them an update. You can only give an update against an approved program. Do the updates. Make sure you maintain the updates internally and you keep those to record everything you're doing. So you carry out exactly, but force the hand, have a discussion, sit around the table and just force it, because you need to get that program. And then the final question was, who owns the float in the program? Whoever gets there first. If the contractor owned the float, every planner, before he started a program, and I have never seen this, and I've never done it, go, right, how much float shall I have on the full floor? Or how much float shall I have on that hospital wing? It's never programmed that way. Float is a byproduct of the program logic. If you program correctly, you logically link all the works correctly, it will give you float. If you've done it wrong, you'll have silly float. If the client owns the float, then he should actually dictate to you how much float he wants on all the different areas, and he never does. So he wants to own the byproduct of your program, which doesn't make any sense, because let's take an example of your program is terrible. You've got illogical links and there's massive float on it. We're saying the client's approved that program wrongly. He now owns all that illogical links and all that excessive float. It just doesn't make sense. So the float's a byproduct of a logically linked program, and therefore whoever gets to that float first and needs it because of a problem uses it. Other seminars, if you ask me the question of supposing both the employer and the contractor have a delay on the same activity at different times, is that fair? We can address that one at another time. Over to you, Andy.
Right, thanks, Lee. The same old questions time after time after time. We get these on our training courses all the same, but you know, these are important ones, so keep them coming. Franz Talyard, one of our claims class students, actually. Very nice to hear from you, Franz. Franz's question is, under the FIDIC contracts, can the engineer reject a contractor's notice, and how should we respond if the engineer does so? This makes me laugh because I've come across this many, many times. Think about how a contract's put together. We've got a client. He employs somebody to design his project, and very often to recommend what form of contract he enters into with the contractor. And the designers, who often become the engineer under the contract, we're talking FIDIC here, they recommend a version of FIDIC or another contract which has notice provisions. And I'm actually in the middle of writing a book on the FIDIC notice provisions, and even I didn't realize just how many obligations there are in FIDIC for the contractor to give notice for this or that. It's raining, give a notice. It's not raining, give another notice. Now, it makes me laugh that once the project kicks off and the contractor finds, oh, we've been delayed by this, there's a design error here, we've been given a variation order for this, and does what he's obliged to do under the contract that the engineers recommend the client to enter into, the engineer then gets all defensive and says, oh, stop sending me all these notices. And particularly so when the engineer is the designer, and a lot of the problems are being caused by, guess what? Inadequate design faults, omissions, and whatever. So the engineer can't reject something that the contract says you must send. He might disagree with the outcome of the notice, that's fine. But the time for him to disagree is when you followed the notice up with your claim. And then he can say, well, we don't think you're entitled to claim for this because it's not a variation, it should have been included in your lump sum price, or it didn't delay the time for completion, or. So if you've got an engineer that doesn't like to receive notices and rejects them, I would write back to reference the engineer's letter and say, Mr. Engineer, according to subclause whatever, we are obliged to give you this notice. We cannot therefore accept your rejection, full stop. And you find, you know, these things will come out at the beginning of a project. And if you as a contractor start to draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to be bullied, Mr. Engineer. If you do something stupid or something uncontractual, we will respond to you. And very often that will set the management of the project up for the next 2 years by setting these guidelines. It's a bit like bringing kids up or training dogs. You make the rules right at the beginning, and then life gets easier for the rest of the project or the rest of your life as a parent. Right then, Lee, over to you.
Okay, so question from Hisham. In case you are working under a reimbursable contract and the contractor is already delayed, what is the entitlement under the force majeure event, knowing that the contract entitles the contractor for additional time and cost? If you're already delayed because of the contractor himself, the force majeure event won't cover that period. It'll be a different period of time, and so you'll be able to claim time for the force majeure, but not previously for the delayed event. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, this is where you need someone like Lee to analyse the delay caused by other factors, i.e. we weren't working quick enough, and to analyse the delay caused by the force majeure event and calculate, okay, we can't claim for this because we were just working too slow, but we are entitled to claim for this many days because it's a force majeure event. And that will be calculated by way of a suitable delay analysis, right, Lee?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So back to me again. I'm actually tempted not to read this question because I can't pronounce the gentleman's name, but I'll have a go. I'm guessing that you're from Sri Lanka, my friend. Satgunaraja Senathiraja. So that's nothing like it, so my apologies. But the question is, what happens if the contractor did not give formal notice, but stated in a formal letter that he intends to claim for time and additional cost incurred, but with no reference to the clauses provided in the contract? Well, FIDIC 99 doesn't specify what a notice should look like. It does say it should be in writing, and it does say it should be delivered to the addresses stated in the appendix to tender, and it should be transmitted in the form stated in the appendix to tender. So if the contract says notices should be delivered to the employer's head office and you send it to the engineer's site office, well, you've not complied with the contract. 9 times out of 10, you'll get away with it. But if you get into an arbitration situation and the lawyers are wanting to buy a new Porsche and they're wanting to get the fees out of this arbitration to enable them to do so, they will spend a couple of days arguing about whether that constitutes a notice or not. Now, to my mind, it doesn't have to say this is a notice, but if it has been submitted formally through a letter, and it has been delivered to the correct places and the engineer copied if you sent it to the employer and vice versa, that should constitute a notice. But good practice is to send it in the form of a letter that says this is a notice. I usually put it on the subject line. FIDIC 2017 have actually recognised that the whole notice thing was a bit of a mess. And in the new forms of contract, the latest editions, they've actually specified what a notice should look like, what information it should include, and specifically say if it doesn't comply, it can't be considered as a notice. So if you weren't here for last week's clinic, have a look at the recording because we spent quite a bit of time talking about notices on that one. Shall I take another one, Lee? Because there's just one left for you. This one is from Atish Sharaf. In the COVID-19 situation, coronavirus again, it's necessary to issue a notice for delay due to the pandemic during the disruption period, or can we issue the notice when the total disruption period is over? Now, certainly FIDIC and just about every other form of contract that I've ever dealt with doesn't want you to, in fact, obliges you not to wait. Give notice as soon as possible, as soon as reasonably practicable. These are the phrases used. The 28 days is just for if you intend to make a claim. And you have 28 days to actually decide whether do we want to claim for this event? Did it actually affect, it's a delay, but did it actually affect the time for completion? did it cause us to actually incur costs? So my advice is get your notices in as soon as possible. Make sure that they're compliant and submitted and composed in accordance with good practice. And if you're not sure what that was, look at the recording from last week. One again for Lee from Jasmine.
Jasmine, under FIDIC 99, how do we deal with the indirect impact of coronavirus, where the works have not stopped, but due to panic among the workers, efficiency is significantly reduced? So we're talking disruption. To prove that there was an effect and your efficiency has been reduced, you need to show that before the panic started, what your production was. So you'll have to prove your efficiency. So disruption, measured mile, various ways, but you've got to have records to monitor the works you carried out as planned, productively, and then show the variance between those two. So after the panic has occurred, you believe your labor force is inefficient now, show what they're actually producing, and then you can prove that based on that record before, this is what you could produce. Now you can only produce this. But to say the panic among the workers, I think it's going to be a tall order to try and get that through. But if you've got the records for disruption, and it's the hardest thing to record on a site, how many men you had on the task, on what day, when they stopped, when they recommenced, when they finished, how much they were doing each day, it's extremely hard to do. But that would be the only way you could prove that efficiency had been affected. And that's it. I think there was one more, Andy, Salvatore, which is pretty much on the similar point you just had.
Yeah,
28 days notice.
Salvatore, hi Salvatore, another one of our claims class students, just to give a plug to our training courses and everything. According to FIDIC 99, subclause 20.1, notice shall begin within 28 days and detailed claims within 42 days. What happens if the contractor delays the details submission of the claim for more than 42 days? Well, the answer is not a lot, really. FIDIC is very specific and says if you don't submit your notice of entitlement to claim within 28 days, you can't have anything. That's called a condition precedent to entitlement, but it doesn't make that same qualification and requirement for the submission of your claims. There is, however, a rider to say that the engineer is allowed to take into account if he was prejudiced to carry out a proper investigation into the circumstances because of the late submission of the claim. If you've got good records, it's very difficult for the engineer to argue that there was nothing that can't be proven. But, you know, as always, our advice from the ICCP is contractors, don't wait until the end of the project to submit your claims. Don't wait to see what happens. Get your claims submitted. If you're not doing them within 42 days, at least do them within a reasonable period and not wait until you're in a big mess at the end of the project. So thanks, Salvatore. One more from, well, actually several more from, if I get the name right, Dinoshika. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Okay, is it acceptable to use a meeting minute to prove that the contractor has notified the employer? Well, yeah, we've sort of discussed on this, and a meeting minute, if it's in writing, if it's been given to the employer or the engineer, can be argued as being a notice, but it's bad practice, it really is. People like myself and Lee have spent many hours arguing why the contractor should still be entitled even when he's not submitted a notice. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The message is it takes half an hour or maximum an hour to write a notice and send it where you should do and to the people you should do. Why wouldn't you do that, contractors? Yeah. You know you've got to do it, just do it. Yeah. Same question. claim question again is clause 20.1, the procedure that has to be applied to any claim application by the contractor, such as for a variation, extension of time. Well, yeah, a claim is really just asking for what you're entitled to and evaluating the amount that you're entitled to in terms of this number of days extension of time or this amount of money. So that's all a claim is. So if you're not getting paid for a variation, because the engineer doesn't regard it as being a variation, he's saying, well, you should have allowed for it in your lump sum price. Well, the only way you're going to pursue that, if the engineer doesn't acknowledge that an instruction or something is a variation, is to submit a claim, and that claim should include all your arguments as to why it should be a variation and set out your opinions to the engineer. Third question, clause 20.1 states that the first detailed claim has to be submitted within 42 days. Sorry, we've already dealt with that under Salvatore's question. It's about what happens if we don't submit within 42 days. And I like this because this gentleman or lady is actually thinking, in a clause 19 force majeure event, is it acceptable to issue notice as per clause 19.2, 19.4, 8.4 and 20.1 in the same letter? Yes, whatever you put in your notice, the main thing is put your notice in, and if more than one clause are relevant to the amount that you're giving notice about, put them all in there. It's better to have too many clauses than not enough recorded in your notice. So glad to see that you're thinking about submitting your notices. Don't leave it too long. So that's it for the pre-submitted question, and I think that's it in terms of time, Nina, is it?
Yeah, we're just a couple of minutes past the half an hour, so I think we'll leave it there for today. We've been absolutely inundated with questions for these clinics, so we really appreciate your support, and we're glad that we've been able to create a bit of an online forum for you all whilst we're all working from home. Any questions that we didn't have time to address today, we are keeping a rolling list. So if you join us next week, your question will probably get asked and answered, sorry, at the beginning of next week's clinic. And then again, we'll go on to live questions on the session. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we hopefully will see you next week.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Nina. Thanks, Lee. Thanks everybody for joining us. See you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.